Hello, everybody. This is Barry Chase, the senior partner at ChaseLawyers, coming to you today from my home during the coronavirus pandemic and answering some questions that we get fairly often from clients who want to know about film option agreements of something that they may have created. The first thing that I want to talk about is the categories of creative work that might attract the interest of a film producer. You might think that those are going to be screenplays or books, and you might say to yourself, well, I haven't written a screenplay, I haven't written a book. But it's not just those two categories. If you've written an article, particularly an extended article in some magazine, or if you've written a short story, or, and this is something everyone's got, a life story. If your life has been unusual enough, it may well attract the interest of a film producer. And so this is for anybody really who might ever be approached by a film producer who thinks that something they've done or something they've lived qualifies as an idea for a feature film or a documentary. Now, you might ask me, why would anyone want to approach me? Why would a film producer want to approach me with an offer to make a film out of anything that I have? And the answers are, this is for more than just people who write books and screenplays, though those are obviously the things that might more commonly attract a film producer's interest. But there's also short articles. There's also graphic novels. There are also life story rights, and we all have a life story. Now, if your life story is sufficiently interesting, you may well be approached by a film producer who wants to make either a documentary or even a feature film out of aspects of your life or your entire life story. So this could be for anybody. So let's say you are approached by a film producer who finds something that you've either created or your life itself of sufficient interest to think about making a feature film or a documentary. Now, in that case, what are the first things that you should do? Well, the very first thing is to make sure that if you have created something like a book or a screenplay or an article or a graphic novel, that you register it for copyright. I don't mean with the Writers Guild. I mean with the United States Copyright Office, which you can do yourself at copyright.gov. And copyright, by the way, is spelled C-O-P-Y-R-I-G-H-T, not C-O-P-Y-W-R-I-T-E, because it is the right to copy that you are attempting to own. Now, if you haven't done that, let's say you published a book, but the publisher of the book has film rights, you may be out of luck. But the first thing you should do if you haven't yet published your book or your screenplay is to make sure that it is registered with the Copyright Office so that you're protected against anyone else encroaching on your intellectual property rights in it. Now, what's the next thing you should do? Well, you have to start checking out the film producer, himself or herself or itself. You want to check the track record of the producer. You can do so at a website called IMDb, which stands for International Movie Database. You can also just Google the identity of the film producer, and you can see what kind of track record the film producer has had. You also can get a feel for the film producer. You will have at least talked to that person or a person representing the company that's interested in you and check out what they're saying to you. If you find out that they have misrepresented what they've done, usually obviously on the exaggerated positive side, you should run the other way. You don't want to be dealing with a liar. There's a fine line, I know, between puffing what the filmmaker might be able to do with your story and actually lying to you about what they have done. If you find that there has been an outright misrepresentation, you should not work with that person. I have one other test that I jokingly use with my clients, and I say to them, If after a conversation with this person that you're dealing with, you feel like you got to take a shower, don't do business with them. So those are the first things you should do in your quest to negotiate a film option deal. So let's just say, for purposes of this discussion, that the film producer has come to you and simply wants to buy your rights out, wants to buy the intellectual property rights in your life story. Let's assume it's your life story that they're after, since all of you have a life story. The question for you is whether you should sell it outright, sell those intellectual property rights, which would permit the producer to make a film and maybe other things based on your life story. Or should you say to the film producer, I'd really prefer that we do an option deal. Now, I almost never recommend the outright sale, because once you sell it, it's gone. You no longer own the right to make a film about yourself, which is an unfortunate circumstance, particularly if you sell it for, let's say, $10,000, which you may badly need at the time. We could all use $10,000. But then the filmmaker goes and makes a film about your life and other things and merchandises your life and does a TV series on it and ends up making $500 million on it. When he drives by in his Maserati or Ferrari, you're going to feel pretty bad about letting those rights go for $10,000. So I recommend against that. And I also recommend that if you raise the option possibility, you will impress the film producer, because he or she or it may think that, how would you know about this? And this way you'll show that you're not a dumb blonde. So think in terms of insisting on an option deal. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, what is this option deal that this lawyer keeps on talking about? And I don't blame you. It's not an obvious thing that we walk around talking about film option deals. What it is basically is a film producer's effort to sort of rent the rights in your life story for a period of time, usually 12 months, 18 months, sometimes renewable for another 12 or 18 months, renting them exclusively so that he or it or she can be the only person out there trying to gather financing for a film about you, trying to gather stars who are interested, signing up a director who's right for the film. So during that period, it's a development period of the film. He or she or it has got to say to whomever he's approaching, I own the rights here. I've got it. Here's a copy of my film option agreement. You may be more familiar with the renting an apartment or renting a home with an option to buy. It's sort of like that. The price is set on the outset in the actual agreement, but the option itself lasts only for a period of time, after which all those rights will do what we call in the law revert to you. In other words, you get them back after that period, which is one of the advantages to you. So what kind of money are we talking about? What should you be looking for when you start talking to the film producer about a payment for the option that he's looking for to make a film, or to at least go into film development about your life story? Well, the answer is not as much to retire on. You can't really expect a huge payment. I'll give you an example from a recent negotiation that I had about a novel by a very successful, well-known author whose name you would know, and whose novels in the past had been made into films, some of them very successful, and TV series and TV specials. And we were talking in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. That's what we were negotiating with them. So it's not the kind of money that you might think it might be, but remember that if you make it an option payment, there will be payments to be made if the option is exercised. In other words, if the producer says, okay, I've lined up my stars, I've lined up my director, and I've lined up my financing. So we're ready to go, and now you're going to get the option payment, not just the first payment to rent your life story. So let's say the film producer has put together his package of a director and stars, and he's got his financing, and he's ready to do what's called exercise the option. Here's where a larger payment is in store for your life story rights. It might be a fixed price. It is more often expressed in terms of a small percentage, 2% or something like that, of the good faith budget for the film. So if the film is a $100 million budget, which would not be unheard of at all, you might be expecting $2 million, except that in that case, there will be an upper limit on what you're going to get, but it will be decent. It'll be something like $250,000, something of that sort. So when the option is exercised is when you cash in. It's not the rental of your intellectual property rights, your life story rights. It's the actual purchase moment, and that's when the option is, quote, exercised, unquote. So you say to yourself at this point, well, the $200,000 is terrific. We could all use it, God knows. But it probably won't set me and my grandchildren up to be a rich family. So how do I get rich on this life story rights agreement? After all, I only have one life story to rent out and then to sell to this film producer. So how do I get rich? Well, here's where negotiating for subsidiary rights comes into play. And here's where either a lawyer or an agent for yourself or your own smarts might come into play, because you can retain certain rights. For example, the right to do a novel after the fact. After the film has been done, you might want to write or hire a ghostwriter to write for you a novel of your life. Because after all, by the time the movie has come out, you've got a lot of people. You've got a ready-made audience for yourself. So if you retain that right, you might get rich on that book. You also should be a little bit conservative about what to expect. Yes, the first product, which will be this film, will make you some money. But what you're really looking for is a second opportunity in the film business. If your first one is hugely successful, there may be other opportunities that you can take advantage of, and that's where you can ask for something that will be a legacy for your grandchildren. So never lose hope, but realize that this first film option may not be your doorway to unspeakable riches. Okay, so you've been approached by this film producer, and the film producer is interested in either your life story, or perhaps a book you've written, or an article you've written, or a screenplay that you've written, or a graphic novel, or what have you. Something that you own the intellectual property rights in. Now, what kinds of things do we want to make sure that you take note of and that you negotiate for? First thing is what I've mentioned earlier, which is that you shouldn't alienate. You shouldn't just transfer your rights for the first payment you get, because it will be the last time you can ever cash in on those rights. And because if you have an option deal, the exercise of the option will be a much larger payment than you could otherwise transfer your rights in, because the exercise will only happen when the film producer knows that he's got a package that he's created. He's got stars who have committed to the film. He's got a director who's committed to the film that he wants to make. He's got the financing, perhaps most importantly, the financing to make the film. So at that point, you can cash in on a fairly large payment, which you will never have the nerve or the right to ask for before that package has been put together. So remember, don't just transfer outright. Always try to get a film option deal. Now, once the option deal is being negotiated, because you've told the film producer, no, I'm not going to just sell you these rights outright, what kinds of things should you worry about? One is to make sure that you have a reversion of rights clause. If the filmmaker hasn't used some of the rights that he, she, or it has achieved, has secured from you without having used them. You don't want those rights to be put on a shelf when they could be very valuable in a monetary way to you in the future. So if, for example, there are things like novelization rights, where you could write a novel based on the film that gets made, you should certainly, if the film producer hasn't made a deal for those, 3 years or what have you, those should revert to you so that you can capitalize on them, so that you can exploit them. You don't want to let those things go indefinitely and be put on the shelf, never to be seen again. So that's one thing. Now, obviously, when you're talking about reverting rights, you're also talking about limiting the kinds of rights that the producer will have. The producer will want everything. He'll want film rights, he'll want TV rights, he'll want series rights, he'll want novelization rights, he'll want all kinds of foreign rights and things like that. He'll want merchandising rights. Now, if you don't limit those, or at least get a percentage of them, you will find yourself on the outside looking in when the huge amounts that can be made from all those things are getting made and shared with you. So you'll want to be careful about trying to cut down the scope of the rights that the film producer has from you in the first place. No matter what rights the film producer has and exploits and all that stuff, you have to be able to look at its books. You have to know that if you've negotiated for X% of the novelization rights, let's say, that you're in fact getting that percent. Otherwise, it's a signal to the accountants in Hollywood, and they're tricky. You may have heard stories about that. It's a signal to the accountants that we can cheat this guy. He's got no inspection rights. So, he's got to buy into what we tell him we did. You don't want to be a victim that way. And it's likely that you will be unless you have an inspection right of the producer's books. So make sure that's there. There are even cases where I have threatened to pull out of a deal or pull out of a client representation if my client was pushing me too hard not to have an inspection right, because I didn't want other lawyers to see the deal, know that I negotiated it, and see that I didn't even get an inspection right. That would be close to malpractice in this situation. So make sure you get these kinds of rights. Okay, another thing that's very important, almost as important as the inspection right, is what kind of on-screen film credit are you going to get? Is it going to be to you by name? Is it going to be just based on a true story, which doesn't mention you? What is it going to be? And while these things sometimes are governed by the Writers Guild of America, you're not a professional writer, so you probably aren't a WGA member, so you have some freedom to negotiate exactly what that credit's going to be. Credits in Hollywood are gold because they set you up for a second deal where you can say, and you can list on a website like IMDb, International Movie Database, exactly what your role was and what your credit was. And it will say to future producers, this guy's bankable. This guy's someone that we want to make a deal with because this first thing that was based on his rights made $100 million. So that's something that's very important. The credit is extremely important. Okay, now you can also try to get what are called consultation rights in the actual making of the film. Now, understand that you're going to have to give up approval rights over everything. You're not going to be able to jump up during the filming and say, oh, but that isn't the way it happened. You can't do that. You can't say that I had this romantic relationship with so-and-so because I never had a romantic relationship at this point in my life. It doesn't matter. The filmmaker knows how to keep asses in seats. Part of that is setting up romantic relationships. Part of that is setting up danger. There may be some physical danger that the filmmaker either wants to create or wants to exaggerate that didn't quite happen that way, but that will help the film be a success, even though it didn't happen quite that way in your life. So you might get consultation rights on those things, so at least you can be heard. You're not going to get control over those things. Also, if you can possibly get a right to be on set, it does two things for you. For one thing, you can whisper in the producer or director's ear. You want to have a good relationship with the director and try to influence how something does get shot and included in the movie. You may not get what you want, you probably won't, but at least you'll have that opportunity. And also as important is going to be that you're going to learn something about the way films actually get produced. A lot of it's just hurry up and wait, but you're going to learn a lot about how these things actually get made before they're put on screen. So try to get those rights if you can. And then finally, I want to repeat something that was mentioned earlier, but it's terribly important. You want to make sure you've got a percentage of virtually every one of the rights that you transfer to the film producer. Those rights sometimes can be usually successful. You know, if your name is Joe Schmo, there might be a Joe Schmo video game, a Joe Schmo virtual reality experience, a Joe Schmo board game, a Joe Schmo doll. I know those things sound a little ridiculous on the front end, but these things are unpredictable. And a lot of the money that gets made on something as important as a feature film, for example, is money that comes from these secondary sources. So don't miss out on them. Make sure you do that. Now, if you're going to need help in negotiating these things, you ought to find yourself a competent lawyer. We'd love to represent you at ChaseLawyers. You can email me at Barry@ChaseLawyers.com. That's CHASE, lawyers with an S.com. Barry is the first name, Barry. You need someone to fight for you for these things, and someone who's got some sophistication in what can and cannot be done in one of these agreements. So whether it's yours truly or another lawyer that you pick up, we hope it's a good one, think about that, and then you'll be happy with the deal you made, and even happier if the film gets made. So good luck to you, and happy negotiating.
So if you like this video, hit the thumbs up button below and let us know. Also, you can subscribe to the ChaseLawyers YouTube channel for more legal tips for those in the entertainment industry like yourself. And if you have other topics you want us to cover, please let us know in your comments below so that we can help you out in that way too. See you soon.